Nyeba gunle namdole shing yunde gunge genba bo simje gunge nye chikbo tamje genla gun chaze o menje ge yenge bodane dusum sangye gunge ngowo ni rasum chugu ngasuman denzebe zabe lame shabla so wa de 정말 담비추 냠술림베 꿀롱상보 니중기 삼바당 장줍기 심 살다비코니 담비추 룽기추 다디 퇴바당 삼베 냠술림버 슈스
Please start by arousing the most excellent, pure motivation, that of renunciation, the wish to attain liberation, and bodhicitta, the mind of awakening, thinking that you're now going to engage with the sacred Dharma, you're going to put it into practice while studying, receiving the teachings, and contemplating on the Dharma of scriptures.
다간시 10월 제외기 추 아주 가상 다 람기린 바꿔라 쉽까브레 차지 모남다 델니 다테나니 데린 니파 람 똑제기 시랍스니 디콜라 쉽까브레 다람 똑제기 시랍델라디니 퇴비 시랍 삼비 시랍 곰비 시랍 숨기 권이 람데랑귤레 끼고 그래스니 데니 숨바레 데나니 가상 퇴비 시랍 거디 쉬스니 데링 아니 니파 당 숨바 삼중 당 음중기 시랍 걸라니 르바시마 슈기인스
Right now, we are studying the stages of the path, right? In relation to our text of Gyud Lama, we're actually looking at the way to traverse the path, and we have 5 points here that are all connected to the Mahamudra aspiration prayer. So among those 5 points that outline the stages of the path, we are presently looking at the second one, which explains the insight or wisdom that is absolutely needed in order to accomplish the path. So when it comes to the wisdom or insight, as we have already looked at in the last few Dharma sessions, we are talking here about the 3 types of insight. The one that comes from us studying or receiving the teachings. The other insight or wisdom comes from reflecting, contemplating on the teachings. And the last one is from actually meditating, putting those teachings into practice. So in order then for us to really give rise to this wisdom that we absolutely need to traverse the path, we need to engage in those 3 processes of study, reflection, and meditation. So in the last Dharma session, we have already looked at the first insight of wisdom, the one that arises from studying. And today we'll continue with the remaining 2 types of wisdom, the ones that come from contemplation and the practice of meditation.
다음 제단제바이나 데니 퇴삼 곰숨스니 데 시랍 넘버 숨부디체 아니 데기 미딘쇼 델라디니 미셰베 트리파 테섬기 트리파 아니 다 지신 미살와함 아주 똑바디 템포당 셀보 매바드니 연구열 텐데기 드니 디바숨지 네 시랍숨다 데긴도 좀 디바숨지 드니 다든주 랑귤레기 용베 갑술라드니 고뇽 똑숨스니 도스 고알레나 데즈 렐라바멘도 딩도 데인디 당보 퇴비 시랍세베 갑술로 쪼딩은주 고와세디레 니 삼중기 시랍세베 갑술도 고와디 칼레 뇽알파 규투거레 니 규투거레 데니 곰중기 시랍디 기 용디 뇽와디 똑발라파 세보다 템포줄을 차도거레 디인디 다 시랍숨 미딘초긴 도초 디바숨 근데 냠술 내용 백갑술라데 내갑숨맘 고뇽 똑숨 선도스야 도도와 다 딘주 다 고뇽 똑숨 세 딘주 아주 낭베기 취직을 제와이나 치코라는 네바침부지열에 고와스디 지당다고 뇽와스디 딜레 사바다고지 똑와스디 시라게다 템보당 세보 슉침부지를 쓰기를 다 이내 딘수야 게리 심발에 규두두두 따다지 랩투그 유는메나 디 디스 다해래도 와
The three types of insights, the ones that come from studying, reflection, and meditation, they overcome, or you can say they clear away the three types of obscurations that are present in our minds. So the wisdom that comes from studying clears away the obscuration of ignorance, of not knowing. The wisdom that comes from reflection clears away our doubts. And the wisdom that comes from meditation clears away the obscuration of not realizing the natural state clearly and you can say in a clear and stable way, right? Not seeing the natural state as it is, that kind of obscuration is cleared away through the development of wisdom meditation. So in this way, we have these three wisdoms and we have three types of obscuration. But I think it will be also very easy for us to understand the process of developing three wisdoms if I add another three, we can say the threefold list that also is connected to the three types of wisdom. So that list is known as the intellectual understanding, experience, and realization. Perhaps you heard those. So how those relate to the three types of wisdom? Well, the first wisdom that comes from studying or receiving the teachings is nothing but that intellectual understanding, right? Theoretical understanding, the first among those three, we can say, three processes that happen in our mind stream. The wisdom that comes from contemplation, it's what we call experience, right? It's when our intellectual understanding through reflection on the teaching slowly turns into a personal experience of the teachings, right? We're kind of tasting the teachings in this way. And then the third wisdom, the one that comes from meditation, that's kind of equals in these three processes, the one that we call realization. What we mean by realization, we mean a very clear and stable understanding or realization of what is to be realized, right? And in Tibetan, when we say those three terms that are translated as intellectual understanding, experience, realization, they have a very strong connotation that right away we can understand, okay, the first one is nothing just but a mere intellectual understanding. The second one is very much experiential, right? Much more deeper connection with the Dharma on a deeper level when we use that term. And when we say the term for realization, right away when we hear this, oh, realization, right, Tokpo in Tibetan, the person understands like, oh, it's this very stable, extremely clear and stable way of having insight, right, compared to the previous stages. So I'm not sure when it's translated into other languages and you say just understanding, experience, realization, if you right away have the same type of sense, right? But in Tibetan, that's kind of very clear that each subsequent one is more profound than the previous one. And in this way, that's how the free wisdoms also go, right? The free wisdoms that comes from from receiving the teachings, then the one that comes from reflecting, the one that comes from practicing meditation. They clear away the free obscurations of not knowing, having doubts, and not seeing clearly reality as it is. And what are those wisdoms really is this free processes of gaining intellectual understanding, then deepening it in a way of gaining real personal experience with that knowledge and making it clear and stable realization. So good to then keep in mind this kind of scheme.
Pena ngaranzu nge nyong nge tok song sini dus labai na peche yewa chi mishi pesu dobu yore. Ini yang nganzu gom gyab yongde ta niluk nyong song se da niluk tok song se de la salge sal misal tang zog ma zog tang ten mi ten la so pa tinde ki keba chimbo yonggo yo sung bare tadi gom gyab gen kwarang gen wala du sebo yonggo yo sarwa nyam dang tokpa ni ki bala da ngaran so yang de zu ta gowa chamji ma to kale khabu indi tinzu ni nge nyong song nge tok song se de la keba che kala khab wa.
So when we hear like the words, oh, I experienced something, or I realized something, for us, it might be quite hard to distinguish those two statements, that someone has experienced something or someone has realized something. We might think, well, they're kind of same, right? But in reality, there is a big difference. From the perspective of the one who meditates and trying to realize the natural state of all phenomena as it is, there's a big, big difference between saying I experience natural state and I realize the natural state. There's a difference in terms of the clarity of that experience or realization. There's a big difference between those two in terms of clarity, in terms of stability, in terms of how vast and profound that right experience or realization is. So meditator knows the difference, right? The one who actually experiencing, engaging with that natural state knows that, well, when I say I experience it, I mean that. When I say I realize it, I mean really much more clear, stable, extensive realization. But for us, when we're just studying these terms, right, we're learning them, we struggle to really distinguish the difference between experience and realization.
Di nganzu gom ti zo chajang dine gom yong tu dine mangbu chegi dangbu di nyam di tokwa re deni nyam dang tokwa la mangbu chi chu du go re suni tadi lama chengi dan tenpa ngori chegu dwa kare nyam yinba dang kare tokwa yinba di nyam di kechimbo shira zigi yo ma re tokwa di kechimbo zigi yo re dini dawa shira yu di dini nor yungu yo dini tatile dinde kin gom ke rinpa de su na dini ngori yungu dwa.
In the instructions on the meditation on Mahamudra, it's clearly stated that in the beginning, meditators often confuse their experiences for actual realization. So this word experience, even we use sometimes directly in Tibetan saying nyam, like meditative mood, right? Just meditative experience. But meditators think that nyam, just that temporary experience, is actually stable realization. That happens. And in order to clear away that, well, the meditator needs to seek a qualified teacher and to receive instructions that point out the difference from that qualified master of meditation who can actually help the meditator to distinguish and to understand that those temporary meditative moods, experiences, nyams, are not that important. They come and go, and they do not constitute a real, stable, clear realization.
나서 다 간주 가상 룽릭 퇴베 미시 디블레 돌세 디게디니 퇴비 시랍된 바라와 다 드링디니 시간 니빠 맹아 삼베 태준문나 좀세 디게디니 삼중기 시랍된 거래.
Let's go back to the text that is the Mahamudra Respiration Prayer, where verse 5 is the one that we are looking at, that explains the wisdoms, and we have already finished the explanation of the first line. Studying scriptures and reasoning frees from the obscuration of ignorance. Right? That explains the first insight. Wisdom comes from studying. And now we'll continue and we'll explain the second line here that reads, contemplating the oral instructions conquers the darkness of doubt. So this line, right, explains the second insight, the one that comes from contemplation.
다디 칙디 다 돈다 도디라고디 가리순 거야 그래서는 맹악라 때니 삼중기 시랍디 끼고 그래 삼중기 시랍디 끼송와이나 디바숨기 나니 니바 태숨기 디바세 디디니 세트 그래 숨바래
To give a very brief explanation of the line, of the words itself, well, this line of this verse explains that by relying on the oral instructions of a teacher, we will come to develop this insight that comes from contemplation, and that insight will clear away the second type among the three types of obscurations. That's the obscuration of our doubts.
다 삼중기 시랍세 디 퇴비 시랍당 퇴비 고와디 당디니 곰비기 똑바지로 와 디니기 발라디니 데와스웨킹기 나란스이나 브리치 타고 레가지기 디 내가 차워진 숭바래 다 딩상기 뒤설라 아주 삼박당 바 있네요 페제 퇴바니 람상지 야나 퇴바강나 락 야나 퇴베네 람상 곰발라 총두거래 디인디 삼중기 시랍도 발라 망부치기 라두거래 다 디기 제네들이 아주 곰디 약법 마용와 템보 미용와 지금도 아주 곰디 김신직디 삼중기 시랍디 매밤 디니 그 바르들 갭다고 침부치라고 그래. 만족이 고와디당 또바니 그 바르들 용와디 매용도 바동 침부치라고 그래. 디는 음악이 가담게 라마든 저기 로말라 가규스나 랍제트니 나요래. 아주 로종된 나라. 로마든 저 퇴기 디세 가서 틀로 매발 남상 곰초조지기도 곰바당 남상 똑바 데부 토보에서 빼 del아지기도 러쉬 봐 근데 전에 연구 말했어 그래 갈래 진짜 야고 다다치 도고 그래서 딘디디니다 삼중기 싫어서야지 게좀부지 차거래
Die Kadampagi Kagyupagi Lamala.
Chitang Kong Nambaki Labja Dinsu Nangla. And Loma Dinsu Tebai
Die Kadampagi.
Tebai Yago Majiwajin Lamsang gom gyayla pe rush chigdu surwa. Ani gom yagode ma
Yeah, di hakuson ina sugi.
kadam ki lama dinsu nangla lapcha dinsu nang tani sungudu wa.
So what is the second type of insight that comes from contemplation? It is said to be extremely, extremely important in the way that it actually bridges the wisdom that comes from study and the wisdom that comes from meditation. In other words, it's really a bridge between us studying and learning new material and realizing the sacred Dharma, right? That's kind of what links those two. These days, though, a lot of Dharma followers, they either just get stuck with the first one, that is to say, studying and gaining intellectual understanding, and they just kind of remain on that level, just having a lot of knowledge and intellectual understanding. Or there's a lot of people these days, they, having studied a bit, they jump right away into practice of meditation, really deep and extensive practice of meditation, and they bypass the process of reflecting on the teachings, taking them to heart, really, right? Contemplating the teachings. They lose that process in the middle. And that's why their practice of meditation fails, really. They don't get, they don't get a really stable and enduring practice of meditation, exactly because they lack the previous step, the one of contemplation. So it's really like there is a gap, like for a lot of people, there's a gap between having intellectual understanding and then having realization. Like they lack that process of, between intellectual understanding and realization, that is experiencing the teachings, right? Making them really personal, taking them to heart, right? That process of contemplation shouldn't be overlooked. It's really, really important. As Kadampa masters instructed in the past, kind of like a bit scolding their disciples, saying like, well, these days people having not studied much, right? They right away want to meditate. And then without meditating much, they expect to have realization right away, right? So there's this rush. They pointed out there's this rush, right? Not being concerned too much with study, jumping to practice, and then, right away wanting to have a realization from that practice of meditation, but that doesn't work that way.
Tindu da nga zu namju che dupdi ti zo karasa korwa. Soba sa korwa nga zu dungal danglengi soba pe chik rush mewa che yan lelo maimba che ani kale la chik tolerance sa korwa karasa korwa ta chik kale dotubeki guktubeki wa patient ti nega sa korwa ti long term project of chati ge yoba indi ani instant dharma to samatang ba na di kala ko imdo wa.
That's why it's of utmost importance to have the patience that willingly accepts the difficulties that come up on the path of the Dharma, right? Willingly accepts means really being able to put up with all these hardships and difficulties without rushing and wanting result right away. And of course, without also being lazy and lax. So really this patience really important because that sort of enables us to engage with the Dharma as a long-term project. Because, something that of an instant Dharma is not really possible. I mean, it's really difficult to have this sort of instant Dharma accomplishments.
Da 다 지당 니 단위 슈바난신 삼중기 시랍세디 뇽와당 되봐야 되버시래. 단 지당 남기용 아주 시랍 숨세디 시랍 민다와 숨이요래 세게요 말에. 아주 시랍디 거 야르게 도용데 값을라지. the transformation transformation 그러바 니 규르디 갈래 민다와 숨라 규르고 요래. 그래서 아주지 사분니 동보니 데블을 찾대베 소라고 싫어봐. 어떤데 지글 세게요래. 다딘데 고와디 당 아주 뇽와라 니 규르고 요봐. 고와디 뇽와라 니 규르 쳇들라더니 삼중이 시랍디 딜라 삼중이 시랍 세요래.
In this way, the wisdom that comes from contemplation is very much connected to our experiences, right? Experience, kind of really tasting the Dharma, making it personal. But we shouldn't think that there are these three types of wisdoms and they're really distinct one from another. Like this one and then another one is something else, right? Actually, it's the same wisdom that just one transforms into another at the different stage of the path, right? They're not different. It's like the seed that transforms into a sprout and eventually transforms into tree and a fruit, right? They're not completely different. It's a process of transformation where we start by gaining intellectual understanding, and that intellectual understanding then transforms into experiential relationship with the Dharma. And that transformation, that process of transformation, we call insight that comes from contemplation.
다 삼중이 시랍세디 그래 당 아주 남기지 카게를 삼로 땅 바에는 지금 인지kel라 에너지 가서 올 거야. You have to feel it like 와. 어떤 데다 오질 쓰기 어렵다.
This wisdom insight that comes from contemplation is just like what we say in English, you have to feel it, as Khenpo said. Right? When we say you just have to feel it, that's the one, right? That's that second type of wisdom.
대당당이 고송세 대당이 용송세 뜻이 개발되어지 연구도 와.
Right? And then we see there is a difference, right? When we say, oh, I heard it, and oh, I really experienced it, right? We can see that difference in those two statements, between those two statements.
그래서 다 아주 디 책도 나라 당보대 가르치고서는 맹아세도 와. 맹아세디 다 가장 아주 퇴비 시랍디 가와를 땡고 그래서는 롱릭을 땡고 그래 숨바라와 되니 다 삼중기 시랍디 가르에서는 다 거기 빵자디 태숨이 임바인데 되니 되게 년보디 다 가와를 땡고 그래서는 맹아를 땡고 그래 숨바래
And the line here explains that this type of wisdom, this experiential understanding of the Dharma comes by relying on oral instructions. If the first type of wisdom that comes from studying really relies on scriptures and reasoning, right? Then here, because what is to be cleared away by this type of insight is our doubts. Therefore, the real antidote, right, for doubts is our own experience, our own, insight that comes from us reflecting on the Dharma. Reflecting on the oral instructions. sorry, right? So because here the what is to be abandoned is kind of doubt, then the antidote to those doubts is to rely really on oral instructions.
다 맹아디 가장의 지 슈심바예 뭐니지나 가장의 담가세드 슈상 아주 칭니여래 맹아세드 담가세드 다든지 지당 것이라 개봐요 말하니 가장 공도 슈 되게 좀 보이바디 아니 다 지당 맹아스네 간디질을 세교에서나 다 맹아스들라 고카르세 림바카시질 섬다예래 지당 섬당 바에는 맹아스나다 베나 상게 라고디 다 좀바 좀 된데 라고지기 아니 수수 동알용 동알 때레 탈비게 탑디 랑이 니니 저와 닝지 침벽거니 신심진기 체도라 디레제 야포도 디마제 디 아니 가줄로 동아티기도 스니지 숭샤베게 랍자당 담가 차상라 랍자디를 차상라 맹아스니 고알린 주거래 베나지 파마디 수수 강의 망보지 체닌다 저와 닝지 침벽거니 부굴라 강에디 마티나 지마룽 삼베거니 지다 계란 딘디제 딘디 야고도 디진의 펜도도 디진의 너바 연구도 스니지 랍자 지 띠그러와 디지디다 지당 덴베 데버샤베기 숭샤와 차상라 맹아 스니 고추거래
Dilada minakra.
맹아
So this term that in our text, that we use in English, is translated as oral instruction, actually also often rendered as PIF instructions, right? Essential type of instruction. I had already mentioned that there is these two terms in the Dharma. One is like oral instruction, another we translate as PIF instructions, and often there's no difference between those, right? But in either way, here, if we were to be really literal from the Tibetan, the term actually is this PIF instruction. But because they're often the same, the translation here says oral. So it's not like a mistake, but just for our sake, to really understand this term better, let's for now use PIF instructions, right? So generally, what do we consider PIF essential instructions in the Dharma? Well, generally, anything that the Blessed Bhagavan Buddha has taught could be considered a PIF instruction because, well, the Buddha, having experienced suffering and discontentment, searched for the methods to free himself from that suffering. And having found those methods, the path, he then, out of his great compassion for all sentient beings, shared, right? Those kind of instructions, like don't do this, you will be unhappy, you will suffer. Do this, that will lead you to well-being and happiness. So all of those instructions that the Buddha imparted onto sentient beings out of his great compassion and loving kindness could be considered PIF instructions, right? Just like the parents who really care for their child so much, loving and worrying for the child and want him or her to succeed in life, to be happy, right? They also give this kind of piece of advice, like, please don't do this, that won't be good for you, please do this, right? So the same way kind of the Buddha cared for all beings, and everything he said, do this, don't do this, we could generally consider as PIF instructions.
tani ina yang tani yang tanda da menga sidi chetala sambatani kwale yuri di sidi kande sego eresana da menga sungen khorangi nyamnyung ge cho chini tini chi kale mangbo gya mago ba duse ringbu gor mago ba duse tungtung chi da ani 딱깔레 시라 갸 마고베 토니 아니 아주 제부 첨보지 톱톱에 딘레기드니 탑 사모드니 용구열에 숨바랬다 라멘 진랍당 스스 소대당 조사 입장나 차상 좀 용도 다 딘레기 진이드니 강달 돌드나 지 뉴스 통동지 링라 디부 첨보지 톱톱에 탑텐샤베기 랍자된 줄 해야 되니 맹아스니 수거봐 다디 지라긴 고바지래 갑갈랑 안주지 수수기 삼노망보 따나야 타 맞추는 라데바디야 라마덴데기 칙직니 수마다 람사지 태숨차사 매바 차도에더니 용거래 덴델라더니 맹아스니 순거래 지라라스 고바이나 다단다 맹아스리 쪼든 줄 순거도 와
But we also have a more specific way of explaining this term PIF instructions, right? Where what we really mean when we say PIF essential instructions is that the teacher who gives those instructions out of one's own personal experience, right? Not having read it in a book, etc., but really from personal experience. And whatever the teacher says, usually it really gives us the method, very swift method to achieve great result in a very short time by experiencing really just few hardships, right? I will repeat that the PIF instruction has this quality that whatever teacher says out of his or her personal experience points out to us the method to very quickly achieve great, really big result, big fruit in a really short time by not doing much in a way of not experiencing too much hardship on a way of achieving this fruit, right? So we can see that sometimes we have something that we just can't resolve for ourselves, right? We still have some kind of doubts, like we still cannot really fully, right? Resolve. Is it this way or that way? And then we go to the master, the teacher, and the teacher says just one or two words. And voila, it clears away that doubt right there on the spot, right? So whatever teacher says, that's what we call PIF instructions. So it's really more specific than just any general teachings of the Dharma. And that's what we mean here in this line when we say relying on PIF instructions. So here we need to understand the second, this more specific way of explaining PIF instructions.
다디 인데 먼저 예 가산 쉬 먼저 뎁 이어바 잠지다 빼절로바 잠지기 되게 매바 인지민지 라마스 된 거에디 라면 진랍스에 내가 저거래도 와 되니 가산 쉬래 가르레스는다 맹아당 담가스에 지당 상기기가 딘주딘주 나래 요래 이내한다 오늘 다네기다 맹아 담가스에서도 라마다 수수자비 라마다 코나비 진랍다 코나발 때는 중국도 와 디면은 대좀 타와든지 대좀 되도록 쥐투고요 말에 디인데 아주 도시 대박가슬라 라마디 시라게 짜심을 찍고 김선치에다 되는 차기도 와 미기 라마 된 거야 돼.
Something I left out from the last section that Khenpo said, and this kind of PIF instructions, right, this kind of enable us to achieve this great result in a very swift, uncomplicated way, because it also really relies on the combination of receiving blessings from that teacher, from that Lama, and from one's own side, it relies on us having done the job, right? Accumulation of merit, wisdom, purification of our own obscuration. So those ingredients need to be present for PIF instruction to work. So that's what Khenpo said earlier. And also, then to continue, he says, as I have already mentioned earlier, it's not enough just to read the Dharma in a book. It's not enough to consult the text. We really need to receive teachers, lamas' blessings. Of course, we have this amazing work of the Buddha's words and the commentaries, the treatises composed by the followers of the Buddha. And that's great, it's important. But here, when it comes especially to clearing away the most subtle, most stubborn doubts that we have, we really need to rely on the Lama's blessing, on the teacher's blessing, right? It's just through that through those pith instructions and the blessing of a teacher that we can really cut through the most subtle doubts and obscurations that we have. So in the Vajrayana, in this vehicle of tantric teachings, there's no way around but then relying on a lama.
Tene ta tindeki jinlap di rangyu la chukbar cheba la penying chebo tinde sungyo azu lamen jinlap se di gangri nashin chires lome ki tini mögü dang deba se di nima nashin chires la bare pena ngaran zu kha kom de na ani chudi gangri gangla kyakwa kyane da gangri gangla kawa yungro ba ine yang kawa di nime mapo na ko shugu mare mashu na chu babgu mare chu mapam na ngazu kombe dunga se tuku marwa tini denashin tini lama la jinlap yoba kyangba digyo mare loma la mögü yoba kyangba digyo mare lome mögü da lame jinlap nipudi tini pena gangri la kawa yoba tang nima shaba nipudi teba ina tinde wangi ani chu mapam ni ngarazu tuni kombe dunga se tuku denashin tini ngazu lamki chir tiba tang lagwar tini tesum dinsu lami jinlap tang damga menga la teni tini segiri esinda tini mangpo sungyo re.
There is a really beautiful analogy to illustrate how this blessing work, right? The analogy is equates the blessing of a lama to a snow peak of a mountain, where our own disciples' devotion is the sun. So now think if you are really thirsty and you find yourself at the bottom of a snowy mountain, you can't like drink that snow, right? You need to make sure that that snow melts and becomes the stream of water so that it can really quench your thirst. But the snow is not going to melt unless the sun of our devotion, unless the sun shines on the peak, on the snowy peak. And so that's exactly how it works also, right? With our devotion, with our like sun-like devotion that shines on the snowy peak of the master's blessing, then the stream can come of this water that will flow right to us so that that can quench our thirst. So in this way, it's not enough just to have devotion, and it's not enough for Lama to have that ability, that power to bestow blessings with those. The combination is really important, right? So, and we receive that blessing by receiving really pith instructions, this kind of oral instruction. That's really essential advice from the guru, right? That's what's actually going to quench our thirst, our clear away our suffering.
Tachidang lome ki lama wangdu du se di kale khabarwa yoku marwa lama di nipa chumbare loma di chungchung re ina ya lome ki lama wangdu duye ki tapshi chigyo re sungbare di gar res na tini mögü res mögü wangi lama wangdu du suni ta kirangi ngone dane semni tse chigdu lama la mögü jesha bayina lama digi kirang la 아니 진랍 난게 이 메시는 라와자네 용 말에 송말에
generally there's no way for a disciple to overpower one's teacher, right? Kind of like subjugate, in other words, sometimes we say maybe like overpower one's Lama. Well, because Lama has all that abilities and powers, and the disciples are generally kind of weaker. But there's a statement in the Dharma that says, but there is one way, only one way, where a disciple has that power over one's teacher. That's devotion. When a disciple has one-pointed, really strong, fervent devotion, the teacher has no power to not to bestow blessings. It's like the teacher has no way not to bestow blessings. So this is the way where the disciple sort of has power over the teacher.
라서 다 된주 명학세디 아주 개비 신인 다 지당 개비 신인 수디 상계다 자주 셈바 차장로 고주고 이내야다 조어디 수수겠다 라마다 된주라 투두고 이디니 또 삼노땅고 그래 에세디제.
In this way, when we use this term PIF instructions, generally, of course, it could refer to teachings given by any spiritual friend, a Buddha, Bodhisattva, but because here it refers to more specifically this very essential instructions given by one's own Lama, by one's own teacher.
다 칙니바들의 가릴랍도스나 삼배 세기도아 삼바 세디 다 디양드니 먼저 삼로 야고 디 칙디 띠저지 인지kel에 슬리퍼리 세고라 지당 삼바 세디 삼로 땅발로 고그러와 먼저 지당 제바이나 삼로 땅니다 간데레샤 세디 딜라야레 아주 인지를 유용되도 contemplation의 규도와 다 이내양 디양 직다 간데 있나 스네 삼로 망보 땅 대바세야 되네라 장냥라 고유여 말에 여봐 디 내가 저거래 미만체기 contemplation 스디디 지 analyze 제데바다 삼로 망보 땅 대바서도 되네 삼로 땅나 딜라세게요 말에 단나 티캅솔라 삼바 세디 간데줄라 세게요레스나 조어디 다 돈다 도도다오디 퇴발을 상지기 숭샤바 다 퇴바지는 고아실레베로와 고아니 수수균 고샤교디 고아쌈라파 마샤바지니 다 나랑기 가르 고송 고샤바디 오니 다니다 수수기 셈난 자르바들세기요레 디캅술 삼바세디 rồi xem đàn journey tiền đi ta đi trước đi tổ qua liền đi xem đàn journey sẽ đi qua liền đi cái chung bộ đó.
Then in the verse we have another word that's contemplating the oral instructions. So important word, contemplation. Right? Because that's really like the wisdom that comes from contemplation. Although the term in Tibetan, sampa, is a bit more slippery because generally, really, the Tibetan word means just to think, right? Thinking. How is it? Is it this way? Is it that way? That's what we usually mean by this term. But here, when it comes to the wisdom that comes from that second process of contemplation, it's not only that. Really, of course, in English, you choose to say contemplation rather than just thinking. But still, many people think contemplation just means to analyze something and think a lot about something, like thinking, is it this way, is it that way? That's not exactly what is meant by this term here, contemplating on the oral instructions, right? So what do we mean by this term, really? Well, so the first process was that we received the teachings, right? We studied, we read, or we heard, so the teachings. And then we gain some understanding, and it's really intellectual understanding. So the next then process, that of contemplation, is really not to leave that intellectual understanding just as a mere theory, but to take what we understood and to integrate it with our own mind. So, in other words, contemplation here means integration with our own being, right? Making it personal, really applying it to one's own mind, to one's own being. That's what we mean by contemplation.
다 디 간주 페나 냠렌다고 질잖아 간데질레 세계르스네 다 아주 미탁바레다 마레스네 아 미탁바레 가르레스는 다 깨지깨지를 찍도 그래 마지에 기초카요 말에 규도 그래 스딩 아주다 하고라 딜라 퇴비시랍 세계르와 디 고아레 데 다 녀마직 소소되니 미탁바데 수수 강라 레비용데 수수 가원예버직 다 카드레바 이나이레 디가나신 드링직 수수도 시고 나라따디 딱가워지 통용바 이나이레 디가나신 당공기 수수 도보 인긴디 드링기 수수라 남줄 켄자버지 땜바 이나이레 딱 아주 남주 망체와 딜라다 만수기 we don't 가서 response 세거래 react 세거래 즉 according to 미탁바디 지금말와 람사지 미탁바라파 가르서 그러면 파지 술라 응을레 맞제 바지는 팔아지 뿌에 탑시당 그러 봐 부자기야베 부셔베 다 덴데 중성 바에나 되니 삼중이 셔랍데 마게 바래 다 수수 퇴비 셔랍 가서라 미탁바세디 장샤바디 다 수수도 삼노타연도 드링드니 즉 교화지 탭도 교화 약보의 인식을 교화 두부의 인식을 라버도 망치 교화 두부 값을 얘는 아주 남주 셈바디 투로 그러봐 다 가레지네 why me 다 딕잡로라 아니 irrelevant irrational overthinking 차용 그러봐 근데 맞에 바지네 람사 아니 다 인지kel라에나 다 가란 뒤제지래 why not 와 신이더니 미탁발라 파지 미탁바디 abnormal dawajila mayin bachini normal dawajila su react chetu baina ta dela ni danda kaspa be samba se tini chetu bachila segure
So then how do we practice some process of contemplation? How does it really take place? Right? In other words, how do we integrate the teachings with our own being, with our own minds? Well, let's take an example of the teaching on impermanence. We have heard it many times, right? We have quite, most of all of us, sound understanding of impermanence. We know that things change moment by moment. They don't remain the same, right? But that's what we know, that understanding is just nothing but the first wisdom, the one that comes from hearing the teachings. And it's intellectual understanding. Like we all intellectually understand and know that impermanence is taking place every moment. But then what happens is that one day it really knocks on our own door. Perhaps we part from our loved ones, lose a loved one, or perhaps it's nothing but just looking at the mirror one day and counting all the gray hair that we have now. Or it could be a friend that yesterday we were really close and today the friend behaves really weirdly and kind of distant and we don't know what's going on, right? It could be any of those situations that we all experience in our lives all the time. But what happens is that we don't react accordingly to our understanding of impermanence. You see, we have intellectual understanding, but when we really experience those difficulties in our lives, a kind of impermanent situations in our lives, what we do, we try to push them away. We resist and we push away impermanence. And that means that we haven't developed the wisdom that comes from contemplation. We have not integrated the teachings with our own mind stream, right? It could be about any change. good or bad, but generally it's really we are tested when bad changes take place, right? When we face with troubles, then we get really confused, or rather, sorry, disturbed. We get disturbed and we start questioning, like, why me? Why did it happen to me? So what happens is that we then engage, as Khenpo said in English, in a lot of irrelevant, irrational overthinking. Basically, we say we ruminate too much. Why? What happened? Why is it me? In reality, if we really have understood and took the teachings to heart, we wouldn't wonder. We wouldn't try to push away or resist, because we know, we would really, really have known deeply in our hearts that I am a conditioned, compounded phenomenon. And the question that I will ask then, why not me? Why these things, why shouldn't they happen to me, right? It's not abnormal that they happen to me. That's exactly super normal. It would be really strange if things do not change in my life in this way. And really, then in this way, not resisting the change and staying calm throughout all of those changes and understanding that they're just natural, that shows that we're really integrating the teachings, that we are contemplating the teachings.
다 아주 낭바지 임비 차네 깨지 셔봐 있네요. 시작이다 놀린 제고 그래스 빼나 차게시로와 다 낭바 인다 면세디 뉴제 탐제 메닥바 사제 탐제 둥알와 최 탐제 동신 담에바 냥엘레 데베시와스니 디 계랑기 미세라 다 간다 데데지 스스라 레비용도 아니 인지 민지 놀린 제고 그래스 마도 딜라파 리지스체나 계란 낭바 마인 바차그레스니 숭고여봐 안 내가 난신게 다 산제기 동알기 템바 군중기 템바 고바 람시 숭여래 안 덴주 소소기 미세칸라 태용도 아니 삼로 당겨래 아니 산제기 숭샤바디 소소기 뭐니 다니 심도니 뇽니 다니 다 산제기 띵은 덴바레도 삼니 간데 남섬이 태좀 망보지 라루와 안된줄라다 삼중기시라 니 단기 쉬번나시 퇴바 잠지 가나 마샤바지니 덴바시다 차게시 된줄 아니 수수 지 심귤 바자니 삼로 땅도 바중바이나 땡원에 다니 기타 최바 약보지 차도 바다 수수그 미세그 강에 망보지 아니 디니세루
Well, being Buddhists, we should really accept the fundamental truths of the Buddha Dharma, such as the four seals of Dharma, right? All conditioned phenomena are impermanent. All afflicted emotions are suffering. There is no truly existing self, and all phenomena are emptiness. And nirvana is a great peace. And so when we hear these things like, afflictions are suffering, conditioned, phenomena change, there's no really self, like, if we don't resist, right, if we don't kind of push away those fundamental truths of the Dharma, if we accept them deeply in our heart, that shows that we really integrated the teachings. We are a real Buddhist. Or the Four Noble Truths, take those as an example, right? The truth of suffering, the origin of suffering, the path, cessation. If we really, really experience that, like that's to say that we don't just, theoretically understand and can repeat those, but if time and time again we have taken those teachings to heart, what happens is then we understand, like, wow, they are true. Of course, like, not understand, like, we really deeply experience these teachings as being true. And doubts then are lost, right? The doubts are gone from our mind stream. But that happens, again, as I said, when we don't leave the teachings as a mere theory, like the four seals of Dharma, the four noble truths. Don't leave them as a mere intellectual understanding, like, oh, da 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 da, this is that, this is this, but really only when you integrate them with your own mind, when you apply them to yourself personally, apply them to your being, to your life, you become a really good practitioner. And not only that, also just in general, your life won't be that difficult. Like all this, you will be able to go through life without experiencing too much hardships. So you will lose that kind of resistance, right?
다 너드나 말한주 퇴중기 시랍긴 고와디 아니 도 스스기 미세기 뇽와라 자니 도토바이나 뇽와 텐송와이나 셈귤라 잡도가 중송와이나 딜라 가르세 그랬으면 삼중기 시랍세 그래서
In short, what I'm trying to say is that this wisdom that comes from contemplating the oral instructions is really experiential wisdom. It's the one insight that we have from really integrating the teachings with our own being, taking them to heart, really applying them in our life, day-to-day life. So then when that happens, that kind of integration happens, that's what we call then, or we have really gained that insight, wisdom that comes from contemplation.
라서 다 드링 아주 우더디나 삼중기 시랍세디 되니 고와당 또바니기 발라 참저적인 인바인데 개춤부시라레스 되니 다 자베체기 나니 맹아당 삼바세 니들라 만절로 좀 장바래 다 맹아스도 지당 아니 템바 까단 된주 차상로 고추 그래서 이내야 니 제달라 지연되다 지 스스 지 강달 지 디스 통동적이라는 디부 첨부터도 왜 탑람되니들라 맹아스기 그래서 디아니 스스 라마라소가 되들 때니더니 영국어에서지 근데 삼바스는다 삼바스의 삼중기 시랍세의 삼노망보당세의 쌈질로 고주 말이스 봐 도드는 스스기 고와디 아니 오늘다니 심기가 돌아 잘받들라더니 삼중기 시랍세기 그래서
That's it for today. In short, what we have learned today is that the second type of insight, prajna, that comes from contemplation, is a bridge between our intellectual understanding and our stable and very clear realization. And we absolutely cannot do without that kind of bridge. Also, we have looked at the root text and we explained the first few words, such as contemplation and oral instructions. But in Tibetan, the order is reversed. So first we look at what is oral instructions, then we looked at what is meant by contemplation. So recuperate oral instructions. Generally, that could refer to all the words of the Buddha and the treatises composed by the scholars, learned and accomplished masters of the past. But specifically, and here especially, it refers to the methods given by one's own guru that are extremely swift and in a very short and very uncomplicated manner can bring about very great result. And contemplation, when we say contemplation, it's important not to understand it as just mere analysis or thinking about pondering over something. Rather, this term contemplation really means integrating the teachings to our, to our being, really taking them to heart, making them really personal and gaining that personal experiential connection with the teachings. And that's what we mean by contemplation here.
장주 semjo rimboje mage bana mage gyureji geba nyambara mebaya Gone Gondun Pelavarai Sho